Good morning. This is Ron, and it is Sunday, April the 8th, and welcome to Storytime. And today I am finishing up the stimulus part of the stimulus and the response chapter of Ayn Rand Philosophy, Who Needs It? It's a very long chapter, and again, divided into basically two parts, the stimulus and the response. And basically, the chapter is a review of psychologist B.F. Skinner's book, Beyond Freedom and Dignity. Who will be the, quote, designers, unquote, of the proposed global culture and the rulers of mankind? He answers unequivocally, the technologists of behavior. What qualifies them for such a job? They are scientists. What is science? In the whole of the book, no definition is given, as if the term were a self-evident, mystically hallowed primary. Since man, according to Mr. Skinner, is biologically unable to project a time span of 3 months from spring planting to fall harvest, how are these technologists able to see the course and plan the future of a global culture? No answer. What sort of men are they? The closest approach to an answer is, quote, those who have been induced by their culture to act to further its survival, unquote, page 180. It is futile to ask by what means and through what agencies the culture, i.e., the behavior of bird brained creatures, can accomplish such a feat, because here we are obviously dealing with a standard requirement of mysticism. Mr. Skinner is establishing an opportunity for the high priesthood to, quote, hear voices, unquote, not the voice of God or the people, but the voice of the culture inducing them to act. But the culture induces a great many people to different courses of action, including the people who paint prophecies of doom on rocks by the side of highways. How are the culture designers and the rest of us to know that theirs is the true voice of the culture? No answer. One must assume that they feel it. Now we come to the grand cashing in on the book's basic equivocation. Mr. Skinner keeps stressing that mankind needs more controls, not less. In a polemical passage, he quotes his critics asking, quote, who is to control, unquote, and answers them as follows. Quote, the relation between the controller and the controlled is reciprocal. The scientist in the laboratory studying the behavior of a pigeon designs contingencies and observes their effects. His apparatus exerts a conspicuous control on the pigeon, but we must not overlook the control exerted by the pigeon. The behavior of the pigeon has determined the design of the apparatus and the procedures in which it is used. Some such reciprocal control is characteristic of all science. Here I omit one sentence, which is an unconscionable misuse of a famous statement. The scientist who designs a cyclotron is under the control of the particles he is studying. The behavior with which a parent controls his child, either aversely or through positive reinforcement, is shaped and maintained by the child's responses. A psychotherapist changes the behavior of his patient in ways which have been shaped and maintained by his success in changing that behavior. A government or religion prescribes and imposes sanctions selected by their effectiveness in controlling citizen or communicant. An employer induces his employees to work industriously and carefully with wage systems determined by their effects on behavior. The classroom practices of the teacher are shaped and maintained by the effects on his students. In a very real sense, then, the slave controls the slave driver, the child, the parent the therapist, the citizen, the government, the communicant, the priest, the employee, the employer, and the student, the teacher. Page 169, unquote. To this, I shall add one more example. The victim controls the torturer, because if the victim screams very loudly at a particular method of torture, this is the method the torturer will select to use. The above quotation is sufficient to convey the book's intellectual stature, the logic of its arguments, and the validity of its thesis. As far as one can judge the book's purpose, the establishment of a dictatorship does not seem to be Mr. Skinner's personal ambition. If it were, he would have been more clever about it. His goal seems to be 1. To clear the way for a dictatorship by eliminating its enemies, 2. To see how much he can get away with. The book's motive power is hatred of man's mind and virtue, with everything they entail: reason, achievement, independence, enjoyment, moral pride, self-esteem. So intense and consuming a hatred that it consumes itself, and what we read is only its gray ashes, with feeble, snickering obscenities such as the title, at a few last smoldering, smoking, stinking coals. To destroy, quote, autonomous man, unquote, is to strike at him, to punch, to stab, to jab, and, if all else fails, to spit at him, is the book's apparent purpose, and it is precisely the long-range cultural consequences that the author does not seem to give a damn about. The passages dealing with the global state are so rambling, incoherent, and diffuse that they sound not like a plan, but like a daydream, the kind of daydream Mr. Skinner apparently finds reinforcing. But he remains unoriginal even in his fantasy, borrowing Plato's notion of a philosopher king. Mr. Skinner fancies a world ruled by a psychologist king, in terms which sound as if small-time manipulators were tempted by the image of a big shot. If only we would abolish autonomous man, quote unquote, Mr. Skinner declares with a kind of growling wistfulness, we would be able to turn, quote, from the miraculous to the natural, from the inaccessible to the manipulable, manipulable, unquote, page 201. This, I submit, is the secret behind the book and behind the modern intellectual's response to it. In Les Miserables, describing the development of an independent young man, Victor Hugo wrote, quote, and he blesses God for having given him these two riches from which many of the rich are lacking, work, which gives him freedom, and thought, which gives him dignity. I doubt that B.F. Skinner ever did or could read Victor Hugo. He wouldn't know what it's all about, but it is not a mere coincidence that made him choose the title of that book. Victor Hugo knew the two essentials that man's life requires. B.F. Skinner knows the two essentials that have to be destroyed if man, qua man, is to be destroyed. And that's the end of the stimulus part of the stimulus and the response in which is chapter 13 of Philosophy, Who Needs It by Ayn Rand. And then ostensibly in the response, we will get a refutation by Ayn Rand, although she's been basically refuting Mr. Skinner's book all along anyhow. So that will be coming up on Tuesday. And until then, thank you very much for joining me and have a great day.